The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension. The judge, an older man with a graying beard and piercing blue eyes, leaned forward, his mouth twisting into a smirk. His name was Judge Raymond Calloway, and he had seen thousands of cases in his time, too many, in his opinion. But today, something about this one amused him. At the center of the courtroom stood a young black teenager, no older than 16. Her name was Aaliyah Johnson. She was dressed in a simple white blouse and dark slacks, standing with perfect posture behind the defendant's table. Despite her age, she had chosen to represent herself, an act that had made the entire courtroom murmur in disbelief when the trial first began. Now, Judge Calloway stared at her with barely contained amusement. "You really think you can do this?" His voice dripped with condescension. He chuckled as he leaned back in his chair. "This isn't some high school debate, young lady. This is a courtroom, and you're playing with the big boys now." The people in the courtroom chuckled along with him. Even the prosecutor, a seasoned lawyer named Richard Owens, smirked at the judge's words. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. Calloway shook his head, flipping through the case file lazily. "Tell me, Miss Johnson, do you even understand what you're arguing? Do you even know what the word jurisdiction means?" Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Aaliyah let them laugh. Let them think she was just some naive girl playing pretend. Then, she took a deep breath and calmly said, "I do, Your Honor. But do you?" The laughter stopped. The entire room went still. Calloway's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." Aaliyah stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "Because from what I can see, you seem to be operating under the wrong set of legal precedents. If you'd like, I can clarify them for you." A low murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor sat up a little straighter. Even the bailiff, a man who had seen his fair share of ridiculous trials, looked intrigued. Judge Calloway's face darkened. "Watch yourself, young lady." "I'm watching closely, Your Honor," Aaliyah replied smoothly. "Are you?" The entire courtroom held its breath. And just like that, the story of how Aaliyah Johnson, a 16-year-old girl, left an arrogant judge speechless had begun. 3 weeks earlier, it was a bright morning in Chicago, and Aaliyah was walking home from school, her backpack slung over her shoulder. She was humming a tune to herself when she heard a loud commotion a few streets down. Curious, she jogged toward the sound and found a group of teenagers gathered in a tight circle. In the middle of the crowd, 2 boys were arguing. One of them, a tall kid in a red hoodie, was her older brother, Malik. "Malik," she called, pushing through the crowd. "What's going on?" Before Malik could answer, the other boy, a rough-looking kid with a buzz cut, snarled, "Tell your brother to mind his business." Malik clenched his fists. "Your friend stole from that old lady down the street, and you think I'm just gonna let it slide?" The boy scoffed. "You got no proof." But just then, sirens blared in the distance. A police car screeched to a stop near them, and 2 officers jumped out. "Hands where we can see them," one of the officers shouted. The crowd scattered in an instant. Aaliyah tried to grab Malik's arm, but before she could, one of the officers grabbed her instead. "Wait," she cried. "I didn't." Before she could finish, the officer shoved her against the hood of the car. "Stay still." Terror surged through her as they cuffed her hands behind her back. Malik was yelling, trying to explain, but the cops weren't listening. Aaliyah's heart pounded as they pushed her into the back of the police car. She hadn't done anything. So why were they arresting her? As the car pulled away, Malik's voice rang out in the distance. "Aaliyah, I'll get you out of this, I swear." But Aaliyah wasn't sure if he could, because for the first time in her life, she realized something chilling. The truth didn't always matter, and she was about to find out just how dangerous that could be. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Aaliyah's wrists as the police car sped down the streets of Chicago. The city lights blurred past her window, but her mind was spinning too fast to take them in. This had to be a mistake, a mix-up, a misunderstanding. She hadn't done anything wrong. But the officers in the front seat didn't care. They didn't even glance at her as they spoke in low voices. "She fits the description," one muttered. "She was at the scene," the other replied. "That's enough for probable cause." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. She had read enough about wrongful arrests to know how easily innocent people got trapped in the system. But she had always thought that if you just explained the truth, people would listen. Now, sitting in the back of a police car, she wasn't so sure. When they arrived at the station, The officers pulled her out of the car and led her inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she was marched past rows of desks, officers barely sparing her a glance. They took her fingerprints, her mugshot. Then they locked her in a holding cell. The air was stale, the walls cold. Aaliyah sat on the hard bench, her heart pounding. Was Malik okay? Did he get away? Would her mom even know where she was? Hours passed. At some point, a tired-looking officer opened the cell door and motioned for her to follow. She was led into a small interrogation room, where a middle-aged woman in a sharp suit sat waiting. Ms. Johnson, the woman said, barely looking up from her papers. I'm Assistant District Attorney Vanessa Green. Do you know why you're here? Aaliyah swallowed. No, ma'am. I didn't do anything. Green glanced at her. You were at the scene of an alleged robbery. We have an eyewitness who claims you were involved. Aaliyah's eyes widened. That's not true. I was just. Green held up a hand. Let me finish. The stolen item, a gold watch, was found a few feet away from where you were standing. Given that, along with the eyewitness testimony, we have enough to proceed with charges. Aaliyah's heart dropped. She felt like she had just been punched in the stomach. But I didn't steal anything, she cried. I was trying to stop the fight. Green sighed. That's not what the witness said. Aaliyah clenched her fists. Then the witness is lying. The ADA folded her hands. If you plead guilty, you could get a reduced sentence. Maybe just community service. If you fight it and lose, you could be looking at time in juvenile detention. Juvenile detention. The words sent a chill down Aaliyah's spine. She had read about those places. Kids went in and came out worse. Aaliyah shook her head, her voice firm. I won't plead guilty. I didn't do anything. Green sighed again, this time deeper, like she had seen this before. All right, then we'll proceed with the case. The door opened, and a police officer stepped in. You're being released into the custody of your guardian, he said. Aaliyah's breath caught in relief. That meant, Aaliyah. She turned just as her mother rushed in, tears in her eyes. Her mom, Deborah Johnson, was a nurse who worked long hours, but she had somehow dropped everything to be here. Aaliyah barely had time to brace herself before her mother pulled her into a tight hug. Are you okay, baby? She whispered, holding her close. Aaliyah nodded, but the tears that burned in her eyes said otherwise. Deborah turned to the officer, her voice sharp. She's a child. How could you do this to her? The officer didn't respond. Instead, he handed over a set of documents. She has a court date next month. If she misses it, a warrant will be issued. Deborah snatched the papers from his hand, glaring at him before turning back to Aaliyah. Come on, we're going home. Aaliyah followed her mother out of the station, her mind racing. This wasn't over. If she didn't fight back, she could lose everything. And she refused to let that happen. The next morning, Malik burst into Aaliyah's room, his face twisted in guilt. This is my fault, he muttered. I should have never gotten involved. Aaliyah shook her head. You were trying to do the right thing, Malik. But now, I have to prove that I did nothing wrong. Malik ran a hand over his face. We need a lawyer. Aaliyah bit her lip. We can't afford one. Their mother had already been working double shifts just to keep the lights on. Hiring a defense attorney would cost thousands of dollars they didn't have. Malik exhaled, pacing the room. Then what do we do? Aaliyah hesitated. Then, an idea struck her. I'll defend myself. Malik stopped pacing. What? I'll represent myself in court, Aaliyah repeated, her voice stronger this time. Malik blinked. Aaliyah, that's crazy. You're not a lawyer. Not yet, she admitted. But I can learn. Malik stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. Man, I hope Judge Calloway is ready, he muttered. Aaliyah smirked. He'd better be. For the next few weeks, Aaliyah threw herself into research. She spent hours at the library, poring over legal textbooks, studying court cases, watching trials online. She learned about wrongful convictions, about bias in the legal system, about the power of evidence. She wrote down every detail of her arrest, where she was standing, what was said, who was present. She even managed to track down surveillance footage from a nearby store that caught part of the incident. And slowly, piece by piece, she built her defense. By the time her court date arrived, she was ready. Or at least, she thought she was. Because the moment she stepped into that courtroom, she came face to face with Judge Calloway. And the look in his eyes told her one thing. He wasn't going to make this easy. The moment Aaliyah stepped into the courtroom, she felt the weight of 100 eyes on her. The judge's bench loomed high above her, and at the center of it sat Judge Raymond Calloway. He adjusted his glasses as he skimmed through the case file, his face unreadable. But Aaliyah could sense something in his expression, a hint of amusement. He doesn't take me seriously. She swallowed, straightening her back. To the right of the courtroom, the prosecutor, Richard Owens, was shuffling through his paperwork. He was an older man with slicked back hair and a reputation for being relentless. The way he barely acknowledged Aaliyah made it clear. He thought this would be an easy win. Aaliyah clenched her fists. She was about to prove them all wrong. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood as Judge Calloway adjusted his robe and leaned forward. "Be seated." The room settled, and Calloway flipped lazily through the papers. "All right, let's get this over with. This is the case of the state versus Aaliyah Johnson. The defendant has chosen to represent herself." The moment he said it, a ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Calloway raised a brow and let out a dry chuckle. "Well, this is a first." He looked directly at Aaliyah. "Miss Johnson, I assume you understand the consequences of this decision?" "Yes, Your Honor," Aaliyah said, her voice firm. Calloway smirked. "Let me rephrase. Do you know what you're doing?" The chuckles that followed sent heat rising to Aaliyah's face, but she refused to let it shake her. "Yes, Your Honor. I do." Calloway exhaled, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." He turned to Owens. "Prosecution, you may proceed." Owens stood, buttoning his suit jacket as he stepped forward. "Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are dealing with a simple case of theft. The defendant, Aaliyah Johnson, was found at the scene of a robbery. An eyewitness placed her there, and the stolen item, a gold watch, was recovered near her." He paused, pacing slowly. "This is not a complicated case. The evidence is clear. The state will show that Aaliyah Johnson knowingly participated in a crime, and as such, she must be held accountable." He turned to Aaliyah, his lips curling into a smirk. "Of course, if Miss Johnson would like to change her mind about that guilty plea, now would be the time." Aaliyah met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not guilty," she said, "and I can prove it." More murmurs. Owens let out a dramatic sigh and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to call my first witness, Officer Matthew Reynolds." A uniformed officer stepped up to the witness stand and took an oath before sitting down. "Officer Reynolds," Owens began, "you were one of the officers at the scene the night Miss Johnson was arrested, correct?" "Yes, sir," Reynolds replied. "What did you observe?" Reynolds cleared his throat. "We received a call about a robbery in progress. When we arrived, we saw a group of teenagers gathered, some of them fleeing the scene. The defendant was still present when we apprehended her." "And where was the stolen item found?" "A few feet away from her, near the sidewalk." Owens nodded, then turned to Aaliyah. "Your witness." Aaliyah exhaled slowly and stood up. This was it, her first cross-examination. She stepped toward the officer, her mind racing with everything she had studied. "Officer Reynolds," she said, keeping her voice even, "when you arrived, was I holding the stolen watch?" Reynolds hesitated. "No, but did you see me take it?" Reynolds shifted in his seat. "No. Did you search anyone else before deciding I was the suspect?" Owens immediately stood. "Objection." The officer made a reasonable assumption based on the circumstances. But Aaliyah wasn't done. "Reasonable," she shot back. "Or convenient?" Judge Calloway tapped his gavel once. "Watch yourself, Miss Johnson." Aaliyah took a deep breath. No further questions. As she sat back down, she heard whispers in the gallery. Some people were nodding, exchanging glances. She had planted doubt. Owens frowned slightly before calling his next witness, Mr. Donahue, the so-called eyewitness. An older man with thin glasses shuffled up to the stand. "Mr. Donahue," Owens said, "did you see the defendant commit this crime?" "Well, I saw her standing there when the police came," Donahue said. Owens nodded. "And did you see her near the stolen item?" "Yes, sir. She was close to it." "Would you say she looked guilty?" Aaliyah's jaw clenched. Before Donahue could answer, she stood. "Objection, Your Honor." Calloway sighed. "On what grounds?" Aaliyah squared her shoulders. "The witness was asked for his opinion, not a fact. His personal feelings about me don't prove anything." Calloway raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "She's right," he said. Sustained. "The jury will disregard that last question." Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest. She had just outmaneuvered a seasoned prosecutor. Owens forced a tight smile and sat down. No further questions. Your witness, Miss Johnson, Calloway said. Aaliyah stood, her mind working fast. She looked at Donahue carefully. His hands were fidgeting. He was nervous. Mr. Donahue, she said, where exactly were you standing when you saw me? Donahue blinked. Down the street. How far? I don't know. Maybe 50 feet. Aaliyah tilted her head. And it was nighttime, right? Yes. Was the area well lit? Donahue hesitated. Well, no. Aaliyah nodded slowly, then turned to the jury. So, let me get this straight. From 50 feet away, at night, in a poorly lit street, you're certain that you saw me commit a crime? Silence. Donahue shifted in his seat. I saw you standing there, he muttered. But standing isn't stealing, is it? More murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Donahue looked flustered. Well, no, but... No further questions. As Aaliyah sat back down, she could feel the energy in the room shift. She was winning them over. Owen's jaw was tight. Calloway tapped his fingers against his bench, watching her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Aaliyah took a steady breath. She had survived the prosecution's witnesses. Now it was her turn. She turned to Calloway. The defense would like to call Malik Johnson to the stand. Malik stepped forward, his face serious. He took his oath and sat down. Aaliyah met her brother's eyes. Malik, she said, tell the court what really happened that night. Malik nodded. Aaliyah didn't steal anything. She was trying to stop a fight. The real thief ran when the cops came. Owens immediately stood. Objection. He's her brother. Of course he'll defend her. Calloway smirked. That's what cross-examinations are for, Mr. Owens. Owens huffed and sat back down. Aaliyah's pulse raced. This was her moment. She turned to the jury. If my brother's word isn't enough, I have something even better. She reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. She held it up. This, she said, is surveillance footage. And it's going to change everything. The courtroom erupted. Judge Calloway banged his gavel. Order. Order in the court. But Aaliyah just stood there, holding the USB. And she knew this trial would never be the same. The courtroom was in chaos. Murmurs turned into full-blown whispers, the spectators craning their necks to get a better look at Aaliyah. Even Judge Calloway, who had been smirking moments ago, was suddenly stone-faced. Aaliyah held up the USB drive like a weapon. This footage, she said, her voice ringing through the room, will prove that I had nothing to do with that robbery. Prosecutor Owens shot up from his seat. Your Honor, I was not made aware of any such evidence. Judge Calloway turned to Aaliyah, his eyes narrowing. Miss Johnson, where did you obtain this footage? Aaliyah squared her shoulders. From a store security camera near the scene of the alleged crime. The owner, Mr. Patel, gave it to me. Owens scoffed. And you expect us to believe that an untrained teenager found evidence the police missed? Aaliyah turned to him. I expect you to watch the evidence and decide for yourself. Calloway tapped his gavel once. Bailiff, collect the USB. The bailiff took the drive from Aaliyah and handed it to a court technician who walked over to the large screen at the front of the courtroom. Let's see what we have, Calloway muttered. The screen flickered to life. The footage began to play. It showed a dimly lit street, the store's security camera capturing the sidewalk outside. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m., the night of the alleged robbery. The jury, the spectators, even the police officers in the room leaned forward. And then, a figure in a black hoodie sprinted across the screen. Aaliyah's heart pounded. The hooded person ran down the street, something glinting in their hand, the stolen watch. Then, just seconds later, Aaliyah and Malik entered the frame, standing near the scene, looking confused. Not stealing. Standing. The real thief had already been gone by the time the police arrived. Gasps echoed through the room. The video didn't just suggest her innocence, it proved it. Aaliyah turned to Judge Calloway. Your Honor, this footage clearly shows that I did not steal anything. Owen's face was red with frustration. Your Honor, this footage is inconclusive. We don't know who that hooded figure is. Aaliyah pounced. Exactly. You don't know who they are. But you arrested me anyway, without any real proof. More murmurs spread through the courtroom. Owens opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in the entire trial, he had no response. Judge Calloway leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Mr. Owens, he said slowly, I assume you have an explanation for why the police didn't find this footage? Owens hesitated. Your Honor, the investigation. Didn't bother looking for it. Aaliyah finished. Owen's jaw tightened. Calloway exhaled and leaned back in his chair. Well, he muttered, rubbing his chin. This is unexpected. Aaliyah's pulse raced. She could feel the tide shifting. The jury was looking at her differently now, not as a suspect, but as a victim of a rushed, careless arrest. Owens took a deep breath, clearly scrambling for a new approach. Your Honor, the defendant was still at the scene. That alone is suspicious. Aaliyah turned to the jury. Or maybe I was still there because I had nothing to hide. Because I wasn't running. Silence. Then, Calloway let out a chuckle. It wasn't a kind one. It was the kind of laugh that said he wasn't happy. Miss Johnson, he said, folding his hands. I'll admit, you're quite persuasive. Aaliyah didn't like the way he said that. But, he continued, this case is still ongoing. This new footage raises more questions than it answers. Who is the real thief? Why was this footage not found earlier? Aaliyah clenched her fists. Why did he sound like he was looking for a way to keep this case going? Owens, sensing an opportunity, straightened his tie. Your Honor, the prosecution requests additional time to verify this footage and conduct further investigation. Aaliyah's mouth dropped open. Seriously? She had just proved her innocence, and they were stalling? Calloway sighed. I think that's fair. Your Honor, Aaliyah said quickly, this case should be dismissed. Right now. Calloway gave her a sharp look. Miss Johnson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't a debate club. Aaliyah swallowed her frustration. Respectfully, Your Honor, the prosecution has had weeks to investigate. I just found this footage on my own, with no police resources, and it immediately casts doubt on their entire case. They don't get a second chance just because they didn't do their jobs the first time. The courtroom went dead silent. Owens glared at her. Calloway's lips pressed into a tight line. For a long, tense moment, Aaliyah thought he was going to shut her down. Then, he tapped his fingers on his desk. Miss Johnson, he said slowly, I suggest you be very careful about how you speak in my courtroom. Aaliyah's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Then Calloway turned to Owens. I'll grant you 48 hours to present new evidence, or I will have no choice but to consider dismissal. Aaliyah clenched her fists under the table. 2 more days of this. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't backing down. As the gavel slammed down, ending the session for the day, Aaliyah felt Malik's hand squeeze her shoulder. You just scared the life out of them, he whispered. Aaliyah exhaled. Good, because I'm not finished yet. But as she gathered her things, she felt Judge Calloway's gaze still on her. And she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Aaliyah barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the courtroom scene over and over in her head. She had backed Owens into a corner. She had thrown Judge Calloway off his game. And yet, they were still fighting back. 48 hours. That was all the prosecution had to scramble for something. Anything that could justify keeping this case alive. She had done everything right. So why did she still feel like she was walking into a trap? The next morning, she met Malik at the kitchen table, where their mom was already up, flipping through the morning newspaper. Did you see this? Deborah Johnson asked, sliding the paper toward them. Aaliyah's stomach twisted as she saw the headline. Teenager defends herself in court against veteran prosecutor. Could this be a historic case? Her hands trembled as she read through the article. It detailed everything. The way she had challenged the prosecutor, the way she had introduced the video evidence, even the way Judge Calloway had reacted. They had turned her into a story. Aaliyah swallowed. I didn't want attention. Malik snorted. You're literally fighting the system in real time. What did you expect? Deborah sighed. Baby, this kind of attention can be dangerous. People don't like when the status quo is challenged. Aaliyah met her mom's gaze. I don't care, she said. I'm not going to let them do this to me. Her mom gave her a small, worried smile. I know, baby. Just be careful. That afternoon, Aaliyah returned to the library, determined to prepare for whatever Owens was going to throw at her. She flipped through legal books, scanning wrongful conviction cases, looking for patterns. If Owens was planning to delay the case, she needed to be ready. She had just started taking notes when her phone buzzed. A text from Malik. Get home. Now. It's urgent. Her chest tightened. She shoved her books into her bag and ran all the way back to their apartment. When she burst through the door, Malik was pacing. Their mom sat on the couch, clutching her phone, her face pale. What's going on? Aaliyah asked, breathless. Malik turned, his jaw tight. The police came by. Aaliyah's blood ran cold. What? What? Deborah swallowed hard. They're reopening an investigation into you. They said they received new information that suggests you might be involved in something bigger. Aaliyah's stomach dropped. That's a lie, she said. They're trying to intimidate me. Malik clenched his fists. I bet it's Owens. He's mad you made him look bad. Aaliyah's hands were shaking. This was a game to them. If they couldn't beat her in court, they would try to break her outside of it. Her mother took a deep breath. Aaliyah, maybe you should let a lawyer take over now. No, Aaliyah said firmly. If they think they can scare me, they're wrong. I'm not giving them what they want. Her mom didn't look convinced. I just don't want you to get hurt. Aaliyah softened. I know, Mom. But if I stop now, they'll just do this to someone else. Silence filled the room. Then Malik smirked. Well, in that case, let's make sure you win. The next day in court, Aaliyah walked in with her head high, but her stomach twisted when she saw Owen's smug expression. He had something. Judge Calloway tapped his gavel. Court is back in session. Prosecution, you may present your new evidence. Owen stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Your Honor, new witness testimony has come forward regarding the defendant's involvement in another crime. Aaliyah's heart nearly stopped. Another crime? Owens turned to the door. The state calls James Carter to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and when Aaliyah saw who walked in, her stomach dropped to the floor. It was the boy from the fight. The same boy who had argued with Malik. The same boy who had defended the real thief. He walked up to the stand, took the oath, and sat down. Owens smiled. Mr. Carter, can you tell us what you witnessed that night? James hesitated. He looked nervous. He glanced at Aaliyah, almost like he didn't want to be here. But then he spoke. I saw Aaliyah take the watch, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Gasps filled the courtroom. Aaliyah's blood boiled. He was lying. Owens turned to the jury, looking satisfied. There you have it. A direct witness. Aaliyah gritted her teeth. Owens thought this was checkmate, but he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. She stood up, stepping toward the witness stand. James, she said, her voice steady. You know you're lying, don't you? James swallowed. And no, I saw you. You were with the real thief that night. Aaliyah cut in. And you're protecting him, aren't you? James looked away. I don't know what you're talking about. Aaliyah took a step closer. Did Owens promise you something? She asked. A deal, maybe? A lighter sentence for something else. James' eyes widened. Aaliyah knew she had hit the truth. Owens immediately stood. Objection. The defense is badgering the witness. Calloway frowned. Sustained. Miss Johnson, be careful. Aaliyah took a deep breath. She had to be smart. She turned to James again. One last question. James hesitated. If I took the watch, she said slowly, then why did the surveillance footage show someone else running with it? The courtroom fell silent. James' face went pale. Owens tensed. Aaliyah folded her arms. You lied, James, she said. And everyone here knows it. James froze. Then, his lips trembled. His hands shook. And then, he broke. I didn't mean to. James blurted. They told me to say it. A collective gasp filled the room. Owen's face drained of color. Judge Calloway narrowed his eyes. Who is they? James looked at Owens, panicked. Owens clenched his fists. Your Honor, James spoke first. The prosecutor's office, he whispered. They told me if I testified against Aaliyah, I'd get a deal on my own case. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Calloway's expression turned dark. He slammed his gavel. Order. But Aaliyah didn't care. She turned to Owens. And for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Because now, he was the one in trouble. The courtroom was in uproar. People whispered, gasped, and pointed, their eyes darting between James Carter, Owens, and Judge Calloway, who was now glaring down from his bench with an expression so tight it could snap. Order. Calloway slammed his gavel. Order in the court. But Aaliyah could still hear it. The tension, the disbelief, the fear creeping into Owens' face. She had done it. She had just exposed the prosecution's corruption in front of everyone. Judge Calloway turned to James, his sharp gaze pinning the boy to his seat. You're telling this court that the prosecution coerced you into lying under oath? James hesitated, his face pale, his hands shaking. He looked at Owens, who was now glaring daggers at him, before nodding. Yes, Your Honor, James stammered. They told me that if I said Aaliyah was guilty, I'd get a deal. I didn't want to. But they said I'd go to juvie if I didn't. More gasps. Calloway's face darkened. He turned slowly toward Owens. Mr. Owens, he said in a dangerously low voice. Would you like to explain this? Owens shot up from his seat. Your Honor, this is absurd. This witness is obviously lying to save himself. James flinched, his eyes darting to Aaliyah. She took a slow breath and stood up. Actually, Your Honor, she said, his story makes perfect sense. Calloway arched an eyebrow. Oh, and why is that? Aaliyah turned to the jury. Let's think about this logically. The prosecution had no physical evidence against me. They already ignored surveillance footage that proved my innocence. And when that wasn't enough, they delayed the case to find something, anything, to pin on me. She walked toward the witness stand, her voice clear and confident. And suddenly, she continued, a witness appears out of nowhere with a new story, one that conveniently benefits only the prosecution. She turned to James. You were scared, weren't you? She asked, her voice gentler now. James nodded quickly, avoiding Owen's eyes. They told me it was just a small lie, he whispered. That it wouldn't matter because you'd lose anyway. Another shockwave ran through the courtroom. Aaliyah faced the jury again. But it does matter, she said. Because if they can lie to win a case, what else have they done? Silence. Pure, stunned silence. Judge Calloway exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. Miss Johnson, you are treading into very serious allegations. I know, Your Honor, Aaliyah said firmly. And I can prove them. She turned back to James. You said the prosecutor's office promised you a deal, she said. Did they put that in writing? A text? An email? James swallowed hard. Then, hesitantly, he pulled his phone from his pocket. My lawyer told me to delete the messages after I testified, he admitted. But I couldn't. Aaliyah felt her breath hitch as James scrolled, and then stopped. He handed the phone to the bailiff. I have text from one of the assistant prosecutors, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They told me exactly what to say. Aaliyah glanced at Owens. He looked like he was about to be sick. Calloway took the phone from the bailiff and read the messages. His jaw tightened. His fingers drummed against the bench. And then, he lifted his gaze, his eyes like steel. Mr. Owens, he said, his voice dangerously calm. Approach the bench. Now. Owens hesitated, his eyes darting to the exits, as if he was considering running. But Calloway's voice hardened. Now, Mr. Owens. Slowly, stiffly, Owens walked forward. The courtroom was dead silent. Calloway studied him for a long moment. Then, with pure disgust in his voice, he said, Mr. Owens, as of this moment, you are being placed under investigation for prosecutorial misconduct. A collective gasp rang out. Owens' face drained of color. Why, Your Honor? This is a misunderstanding. Calloway held up a hand, cutting him off. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus for personal vendettas. The fact that a 16-year-old girl has done more for justice than the prosecution itself is an embarrassment to this court. He turned to Aaliyah, his cold blue eyes unreadable. As for you, Miss Johnson, I don't know whether to be impressed or terrified. Aaliyah stood her ground. I just wanted the truth. Calloway nodded slowly. Then here's the truth, he said. In light of the new evidence, this case is officially dismissed. A rush of relief crashed over Aaliyah. But then, Calloway turned back to Owens. And you, Mr. Owens, will have to answer for what you've done. Two uniformed officers stepped forward. Owens paled. Wait, this is a mistake. But the officers grabbed his arms, pulling him back. Aaliyah watched as the same system that had tried to destroy her was now turning on him instead. The irony was almost poetic. Owens struggled. I was just doing my job. Calloway's face was stone cold. Then you did it poorly. And just like that, Owens was escorted out of the courtroom. For a moment, Aaliyah just stood there, trying to process everything. The case was over. She was free. Malik was the first to react. He jumped up from his seat. Let's go, he cheered, throwing a fist in the air. The gallery erupted, people clapping, whispering, shaking their heads in disbelief. Even the jury looked shaken. Aaliyah turned to her mother, who was already crying, rushing toward her. Deborah pulled her into a hug, holding her tight. You did it, baby, she whispered. You did it. Aaliyah let out a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. She had fought back, and she had won. As they stepped out of the courthouse, Malik slung an arm around her shoulder. You just took down a corrupt prosecutor in a courtroom, he said, grinning. What's next? Running for mayor? Aaliyah laughed, shaking her head. Nah, she said. I think I want to be a lawyer. Malik's grin widened. A lawyer, huh? Guess you caught the bug. Aaliyah glanced back at the courthouse, at the place that had tried to break her. She had walked in as a scared teenager. She had walked out as something else entirely. A fighter, a truth seeker, and maybe, just maybe, someone who was meant to change the world. Aaliyah stepped out of the courthouse, the cold Chicago air hitting her like a fresh start. The tension that had been strangling her chest for weeks was finally gone. She was free. But freedom wasn't the only thing she had gained. She had walked into that courtroom as a scared girl, doubted by everyone. And now? Now she had just taken down a corrupt prosecutor on her own. The entire legal system had tried to crush her. Instead, she had turned the tables. Malik nudged her shoulder. Yo, he said, a cocky grin on his face. You destroyed them in there. Aaliyah smirked. I just told the truth. You did more than that, sis. You exposed a whole mess of corruption. That courtroom was a movie. Aaliyah glanced back at the courthouse entrance, where reporters were already gathering. Cameras flashed. Microphones hovered. And then, someone called her name. Aaliyah Johnson. She turned, and suddenly, she was surrounded. A female reporter shoved a microphone in her face. Miss Johnson, how does it feel to have defended yourself against a veteran prosecutor and won? Another journalist spoke up. Were you ever afraid during the trial? Do you think this case will spark a bigger investigation into corruption? Will you be pressing charges against the state? The questions came fast and hard, like a swarm of bees. Aaliyah's heartbeat picked up. She wasn't used to this. She had spent weeks preparing for courtroom battles, not press conferences. Her mom stepped up beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Aaliyah will not be making any statements at this time, Deborah Johnson said firmly. She's still just a teenager. But Aaliyah suddenly felt something deep inside her shift. She had spent this entire case proving herself. She had fought for her freedom. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to use her voice. She glanced at her mom, then at Malik. Then she turned to the reporters. Actually, she said, her voice steady, I'll answer. The reporters leaned in, ready. Aaliyah took a slow breath. It feels incredible to win, she said honestly. But it shouldn't have taken this much. I shouldn't have had to fight this hard just to be believed. The system isn't supposed to work against you. It's supposed to protect you. More murmurs. The cameras zoomed in closer. Aaliyah continued. This wasn't just about me. This happens to so many people. People who don't have the resources to fight back. People who get lost in the system. That needs to change. The reporters scribbled notes furiously. Does that mean you'll be getting into activism? One of them asked. Aaliyah paused. She had never thought about that before. But the truth was, something had awakened in her during this fight. She had discovered something about herself. She was good at this. Not just defending herself, but standing up for what was right. A slow, confident smile spread across her face. Maybe, she said. We'll see. That night, their apartment was louder than ever. Friends, family, even their neighbors, people who had been watching her case unfold on the news, had gathered to celebrate. Man, we got a celebrity in the house. Malik joked, throwing an arm around Aaliyah's shoulders. She rolled her eyes but smiled. You're never gonna let this go, are you? Not a chance, he said. My sister owned a whole courtroom. That's legendary. Aaliyah laughed, shaking her head. But then she noticed her mom, standing a little away from the crowd, watching her closely. She excused herself and walked over. You okay, Mom? Deborah smiled, but there was something soft and serious in her expression. I'm just proud of you, she said. But I'm also worried. Aaliyah frowned. Why? Her mom hesitated. Because you didn't just win, baby. You exposed people. You embarrassed them. And people with power don't like to be embarrassed. Aaliyah froze. She hadn't thought about that. She had been so focused on proving her innocence that she hadn't considered what would happen after. Would people come after her now? Before she could dwell on it, there was a knock at the door. Malik opened it, then stiffened. Aaliyah. She turned, and her stomach dropped. Because standing in the doorway was Judge Calloway. The entire room fell silent. People whispered. Some even backed away. Why was he here? Calloway, still dressed in his black coat, studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke. Miss Johnson, he said, his voice as sharp as ever. May I have a word with you? Aaliyah swallowed hard. She had won the trial. But something told her. This fight wasn't over yet. The room was dead silent. Judge Calloway stood at the doorway, his sharp blue eyes locked onto Aaliyah. His presence alone sent a chill through the celebration. Nobody expected him to be here. Nobody wanted him to be here. Malik instinctively stepped in front of Aaliyah, his stance tense. "Man, you got some nerve showing up here," he muttered. Calloway didn't flinch. His gaze didn't even flicker toward Malik. "I'm not here for an argument," he said. "I just need to speak to Miss Johnson. Alone." Deborah Johnson crossed her arms, stepping forward protectively. "Anything you have to say to my daughter, you can say in front of all of us." Calloway sighed, looking tired. "Miss Johnson," he said, ignoring the others, "do you really want to have this conversation in front of an audience?" Aaliyah studied him. This wasn't the arrogant judge she had seen in the courtroom. He looked different, more serious, more human. She took a deep breath. "It's okay," she said, glancing at her mom and Malik. "I'll talk to him." Malik's jaw tightened. "You sure?" She nodded. Her mom hesitated before stepping aside, but Aaliyah could feel her watching closely, ready to step in if needed. She followed Judge Calloway outside, into the chilly night air. The city buzzed around them, cars honking, music playing in the distance. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then, Calloway turned to her. "You're a remarkable young woman," he said. Aaliyah blinked. That was not what she was expecting. "I what?" Calloway exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I've seen a lot of cases, Miss Johnson. I've seen defendants cry, beg, even lash out in anger. But I have never seen someone like you." Aaliyah folded her arms. "You mean someone who refused to back down?" Calloway smirked slightly. "Something like that." A beat of silence passed. Then, his smirk faded. "But you don't understand what you've done." Aaliyah frowned. "I proved my innocence. That's what I did." Calloway's expression darkened. "And you made enemies." Aaliyah's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Calloway sighed, looking away for a moment. "You exposed Owens. But he wasn't working alone. The legal system, it's not as clean as people think. There are people, powerful people, who don't like what you just did." Aaliyah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "You're saying they might come after me?" Calloway nodded slowly. "Or worse, your family." Aaliyah's stomach twisted. She had spent so much time fighting for the truth, she hadn't thought about what might happen next. Calloway looked her straight in the eyes. "You have two choices," he said. "You can lay low and move on, or you can step into something much bigger than yourself." Aaliyah's mind raced. He was warning her. But was he also offering her something? She took a slow breath. "And if I choose the second option?" Calloway hesitated. Then, he pulled something from his pocket. A business card. He held it out. Aaliyah hesitated before taking it. The card was simple. "Judge Raymond Calloway, Office of Internal Affairs." She frowned. "You work in internal affairs?" Calloway nodded. "Not officially, but I have connections. People who are tired of the corruption. People who want to change things." Aaliyah's heartbeat quickened. She had walked into this trial alone. And now, a federal judge was standing in front of her, offering her something bigger. "Think about it," Calloway said, stepping back. "But understand this, Miss Johnson. If you choose to keep fighting, you won't be able to stop. Once you see the truth, you can't unsee it." Aaliyah swallowed hard. "I've never been afraid of the truth," she said. Calloway studied her for a moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Aaliyah stood outside for a long time, staring down at the card in her hand. Her entire life had just changed again. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger. She had fought for herself. Now, maybe it was time to fight for others. Taking a deep breath, she walked back inside. And she knew, without a doubt, this story was far from over. Aaliyah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the card. "Judge Raymond Calloway, Office of Internal Affairs." His words echoed in her head. "You made enemies. If you choose to keep fighting, you won't be able to stop." Her fingers curled around the card. She had spent weeks fighting for her freedom. She had gone up against a powerful system and won. But if what Calloway said was true, then the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next morning, Aaliyah walked into the kitchen to find her mom pouring coffee, her movements slow and exhausted. "Rough night?" Aaliyah asked. Deborah sighed, rubbing her temple. "Barely slept. I kept thinking about all of this." Aaliyah hesitated. "Mom, if I could do something more, help fix things, would you support me?" Her mom looked up sharply. "What do you mean, baby?" Aaliyah exhaled. I mean, Calloway. He gave me his card. He says he has connections. People trying to stop corruption. Her mother's face darkened. And you believe him? Aaliyah nodded. I think he's right about one thing. I made enemies. And if I walk away now, I'll always wonder if I could have done more. Her mother set the coffee down firmly. You almost lost your freedom, Aaliyah. Her voice wavered slightly. I can't go through that again. Aaliyah swallowed hard. I know, Mom. But I can't just pretend this didn't happen. What if they do it to someone else? Someone who doesn't know how to fight back. Her mom sighed, her shoulders drooping. You're my baby, she whispered. And I just got you back. I don't want to lose you again. Aaliyah stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her. You won't, she promised. But deep down she knew. If she chose this path, there was no turning back. Later that afternoon, Aaliyah sat alone at a park bench, staring at her phone. Should she call Calloway? She was about to press the number when a black car slowly pulled up to the curb in front of her. Her heart stopped. The windows were tinted. Then, the back door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out. He wasn't Calloway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that didn't blink. Aaliyah's pulse sped up. Miss Johnson, the man said. His voice was calm. Too calm. We need to talk. Aaliyah's fingers curled into a fist. Who are you? The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Someone who's very interested in what you've been up to. Every instinct in her body screamed that something was wrong. She shot up from the bench. I don't talk to strangers. The man sighed. Miss Johnson, don't make this difficult. We know you've been in contact with Calloway. Aaliyah's breath hitched. How did they know that? Her heart pounded. She needed to leave. She turned to walk away, but suddenly, another man stepped out of the car, blocking her path. Her stomach dropped. Get in the car, Miss Johnson, the first man said. We just want to talk. Aaliyah's mind raced. If she got in, there was no telling where they'd take her. But if she ran? Think, Aaliyah. Think. She looked past the men, toward the streetlight nearby. A camera. She had read about how some cities had security cameras on street corners. If she could get into the frame, there'd be proof of whatever happened next. She took a slow step back. Fine, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I'll talk. But not in the car. Right here. The first man's eyes narrowed. Then, before he could answer, a loud voice cut through the air. Hey, what's going on here? Aaliyah whipped around and saw a police officer approaching. Her breath caught. The two men tensed. The officer frowned at them. Everything okay, young lady? Aaliyah didn't hesitate. No, sir. I don't know these men. They've been following me. The officer's hand went to his radio immediately. The first man's jaw tightened. Then, without another word, he turned and slid back into the car. The second man followed. And just like that, the black car sped off. Aaliyah's knees almost buckled. The officer turned to her, concern in his eyes. You sure you're okay? Aaliyah forced a nod. I think so. Thanks for stepping in. But as she watched the car disappear into the city, one thing became clear. She had poked the bear. And now, the bear was watching her. Aaliyah sat on the edge of her bed, her heart still racing from what had happened earlier. The men in the black car. The way they knew about Calloway. The way they had tried to get her alone. Her hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about her case anymore. This was bigger. She needed to tell someone. Her fingers hovered over her phone. She could call Calloway, but what if they were watching her phone? She hesitated. Then, there was a knock at her window. Aaliyah jumped. Her heart pounded as she slowly pulled back the curtain and let out a breath of relief. It was Malik. She unlatched the window, and he climbed inside, his face serious. You good? He asked, his voice low. Aaliyah hesitated, then nodded. Not really. Malik sat on the edge of her desk, arms crossed. Mom's asleep. Now tell me, what happened? Aaliyah took a deep breath and told him everything. The car, the men, the way they knew about Calloway, the way they tried to take her. Malik's face darkened. These dudes try to kidnap you? Aaliyah swallowed. They said they just wanted to talk, but yeah, that's what it felt like. Malik shot up, pacing the room. This ain't right. This ain't normal. These ain't some random lawyers mad you want a case. I know, Aaliyah whispered. There's something else. Malik turned to her, his jaw tight. We need to go to the cops. Aaliyah bit her lip. What if they're in on it? Malik hesitated. She could see it in his face. He had thought the same thing. The system had already tried to bury her once. What if this was bigger than just Owens? Aaliyah clenched her fists. We need to talk to Calloway, she said. Now. The next day, Aaliyah sat in a quiet cafe, her hoodie pulled low over her face. Malik sat beside her, arms crossed, watching the door. Then, Calloway walked in. He was in plain clothes, no fancy judge's robe, no security. Just a black coat and a cautious look in his eyes. He slid into the booth across from them. "You didn't call me," he said. Aaliyah exhaled. "I think my phone's being watched." Calloway stiffened. "Go on." She told him everything. The men, the car, the way they knew about him, the way they had tried to take her. Calloway's face didn't change. He just listened, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. Then he sighed. "I was afraid this might happen." Aaliyah's stomach dropped. "You knew?" Calloway shook his head. "Not exactly. But I knew that if Owens fell, he wouldn't be the only one trying to cover his tracks." Malik frowned. "So who are these guys?" Calloway hesitated. Then, quietly, he said, "They're the reason I started looking into corruption in the first place." Aaliyah's breath hitched. "You mean they're bigger than Owens?" Calloway nodded slowly. "They aren't just bad lawyers, Miss Johnson. They're connected to police, judges, prosecutors, the people who are supposed to uphold the law." Malik swore under his breath. Aaliyah's hands felt cold. "You're saying they control the system?" Calloway leaned forward. His voice was low and serious. "I'm saying they are the system." Aaliyah's chest tightened. She had been right. Her fight had only just begun. She wasn't just up against corrupt lawyers anymore. She was up against something bigger, darker, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And now, they knew her name. Aaliyah felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. She wasn't just fighting a corrupt prosecutor anymore. She was fighting a system, one that had powerful people in its grip, one that had already tried to silence her once. And now they knew she was a threat. Calloway leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me, Miss Johnson," he said. "If they came after you once, they'll come after you again. And next time, they won't just try to scare you." Aaliyah swallowed hard. Malik tensed beside her, his fists clenched. "So what do we do?" Calloway exhaled, rubbing his chin. "First, we make sure you're protected. No walking alone. No answering unknown numbers. If you think you're being followed, you call someone immediately." Aaliyah nodded slowly, but something in her chest was burning. Fear, yes, but also anger. This wasn't fair. She had already fought for her freedom, and now she had to fight to stay safe? She had done nothing wrong, and yet she was the one who had to look over her shoulder? No, she wasn't just going to hide. She was going to fight back. She took a steady breath. "Calloway, how do we stop them?" Malik's head snapped toward her. "Aaliyah." But she wasn't backing down. Calloway studied her closely, as if measuring something deep inside her. Then he sighed. "There's only one way." Aaliyah leaned in. "Tell me." Calloway tapped his fingers against the table. "We gather proof. We expose them. The more light we shine on them, the harder it is for them to operate in the shadows." Aaliyah's mind raced. That made sense. They had gone after her because she exposed them. So what if she did it again? Bigger, louder. "What kind of proof?" she asked. Calloway hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he pulled something from his pocket. A flash drive. He slid it across the table. Aaliyah stared at it. "What's on this?" Calloway's voice was deadly serious. "Names, emails, transactions, judges, officers, prosecutors, people who have been involved in cases they shouldn't have won, people who had evidence disappear, people who made innocent lives vanish into the system." Aaliyah's fingers tightened around the drive. This was bigger than she thought. Calloway locked eyes with her. "If we leak this to the public, if we let the world see how deep this corruption goes, then we don't just fight back." His next words sent a shiver down her spine. "We burn it all down." Malik shook his head, looking between Aaliyah and Calloway like they were both crazy. "This is too much," he said. "You just got out of a courtroom, Aaliyah. You really want to walk back into the fire?" Aaliyah's heartbeat thumped loudly in her ears. Did she? Could she? But then she thought of James Carter, the boy who had been forced to lie against her. She thought of the other kids, the ones who never got their cases dismissed, who had been lost in the system forever. She thought of those men in the black car, and the way they thought they could just scare her into silence. Her fingers tightened around the flash drive. No, she wasn't just walking back into the fire. She was about to light the match. "I'm in," she said. Malik swore under his breath. "Aaliyah." She turned to him, her voice steady. "If we don't stop them, who will?" Malik opened his mouth, but then he froze. Aaliyah followed his gaze. and her stomach dropped. Across the street, a black car was parked. The same car from before. And inside, a man in a dark suit sat in the passenger seat. Watching. Waiting. Their eyes met. Aaliyah's chest tightened. "They found me," she whispered. Malik's face hardened. "We need to move. Now." Calloway glanced out the window, his jaw clenching. "They're watching us. We can't go home." Aaliyah's heart pounded. "Then where do we go?" Calloway looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that almost looked like fear. "You wanted to fight back, Miss Johnson," he said quietly. Aaliyah nodded. Calloway exhaled. "Then let's fight." Aaliyah's pulse pounded as the black car sat motionless across the street, the man inside still watching. She wasn't imagining it. They knew exactly where she was. Calloway stood up first, his voice low and urgent. "We can't stay here. We move now." Malik grabbed Aaliyah's wrist. "I got my bike outside. We can lose them through the back alley." Aaliyah clutched the flash drive in her palm. This little piece of plastic and metal was about to change everything. "Let's go," she whispered. They bolted through the back exit of the cafe, the cold air slapping against Aaliyah's face. The alley was tight, lined with dumpsters and brick walls. Malik's bike was leaned against a fence, and without hesitation, he jumped on, motioning for Aaliyah to climb on the back. Calloway, however, went the opposite direction. "Where are you going?" Aaliyah hissed. He turned, his eyes sharp. "I'll lead them away. You get that drive to the right hands." Malik's grip on the handlebars tightened. "You sure?" Aaliyah watched as Calloway adjusted his coat, took one last deep breath, and walked out of the alley. "Let them follow me," he said. "They'll think I have the files." Aaliyah swallowed hard. This was the last time she'd see Calloway for a while. But she had no time to hesitate. Malik pedaled hard, and they sped through the alley, dodging trash bins, weaving through dark side streets. The black car, realizing it had been duped, suddenly peeled away, chasing Calloway instead. Aaliyah let out a breath of relief. But they weren't safe yet. They rode for blocks, dodging into different neighborhoods, Malik weaving through streets like he had a built-in GPS. "Where are we going?" Aaliyah asked. Malik didn't slow down. "You'll see." A few minutes later, they skidded to a stop in front of a brick building. Aaliyah frowned. "A news station?" Malik smirked. "If we're burning it all down, we're doing it loudly." Aaliyah hesitated, staring at the front doors. This was it. If she walked in with the flash drive, there was no going back. The world would know everything. She turned to Malik. "You with me?" Malik grinned. "Always." She took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the flash drive, and walked inside. The next 24 hours were a storm. The news station broke the story first. Then, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, the files were everywhere, on TV, on social media, in every newspaper headline. Corruption exposed. Secret files reveal web of wrongful convictions and cover UPS in Chicago's legal system. Names were listed. Transactions revealed. Cases that had been buried were now being dug back up. And the public? They were furious. Protests erupted outside police stations and courthouses. People demanded answers, demanded justice. And the biggest bombshell? Judge Calloway had disappeared. Aaliyah sat frozen as she watched the news that night. Judge Raymond Calloway, known for his involvement in exposing legal corruption, has not been seen since yesterday evening. Authorities are investigating his whereabouts. A chill ran down her spine. She knew what had happened. He had sacrificed himself to keep her safe. Malik sat beside her on the couch, shaking his head. "Man, this is insane. You actually did it." Aaliyah clenched her fists. "No, we did it." Malik chuckled. "Yeah, well, you're the face of this now." And he was right. The world was talking about her. Some people hated her. Some people admired her. But no one could ignore her. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't scared of that. 1 year later, Aaliyah stood outside the university building, adjusting the strap on her backpack. She had done it. She had gotten into law school. Her case had inspired reforms, new investigations, and deeper probes into the corruption that had tried to bury her. And Calloway? Still missing. But she knew. Wherever he was, he'd be watching. Malik pulled up next to her on his bike. "You ready for this, future lawyer?" Aaliyah smirked. More than ever. She turned toward the law school doors. This was just the beginning. Because now, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone. And this time, she was unstoppable.